For centuries, Berlin had been a thriving cosmopolitan city, serving as the political capital of Germany. From 1933 to 1945, Berlin was also the seat of Adolf Hitler's Nazi empire. When the Allied forces of Great Britain, USA, and Soviet Russia closed in on the Nazis, it was toward Berlin that their advance ultimately took them. Only by taking the capital and the high-ranking Nazis who'd made it their power base could World War II be brought to a final conclusion. The largest military offensive of the Second World War opened amid dense fog, heavy snow, and a thick blanket of cloud in the pre-dawn hours of January the 12th, 1945, near the obscure town of Baranow, Poland, situated on the Vistula River about 125 miles south of Warsaw. German troops crawled out of their freezing bedrolls, brought painfully awake by a fierce barrage of Soviet artillery fire. Over the next few hours, the Russian shelling came on in wave after wave, destroying virtually all the German artillery positions and inflicting terrible casualties on the enemy forces. Sharply at 10:30 a.m., a massive force of Russian infantry, followed by a sea of tanks and mobile artillery, commanded by Field Marshal Ivan Konev, moved in toward the German lines. For every tank in the German line, the Russians had 7. For every German soldier, there were 10 Russians. Impossibly outnumbered, the Germans had no alternative but to die where they stood, surrender, or break and run. By the time the pale winter light faded out around 4 p.m., Russian forces had penetrated 12 miles behind the German lines and were still rolling forward. For the previous 6 months, Russian positions along the Vistula River had remained nearly static, while other Soviet divisions had relentlessly driven the occupying Germans from one Baltic nation after another. As the success in the Balkans had gained such tremendous momentum, the advance along the Vistula would now begin a week ahead of schedule. Knowing full well that the American and British forces were tied down in Belgium in the Battle of the Bulge, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin sent a telegram of support to Winston Churchill. It read, "In view of our Allies' position, the Supreme Command has decided, regardless of weather conditions, to launch large-scale operations along the entire Central Front, not later than the second half of January." For once, Joseph Stalin was as good as his word, and the ensuing attack on the Vistula caught the Germans utterly and disastrously by surprise. Further north, along the border of East Prussia, the Germans initially managed to hold out against the Russians for 2 days. But once the cloud cover cleared and Russian bombers and fighters were able to move in, the Nazi line crumbled, just as it had done along the Vistula. On January 17th, 5 days after the attack opened, Warsaw had fallen to the Russians, and their forward troops were pushing out along a front that was now 160 miles wide and directed straight into the heart of Germany. Chronically plagued by shortages of men, ammunition, fuel, and food, the German armies were barely able to defend themselves, much less halt the Russian advance. By the end of January, Russian advance forces were only 40 miles northeast of Berlin. During the next few weeks, Soviet armies under the direction of Marshal Zhukov slowly closed the noose around the capital. As the Russians had been moving relentlessly westward through Russia itself, then Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Poland, they passed through countless hundreds of villages and towns that had been laid waste by the Nazis. The rotting corpses of peasants and suspected partisans still lay or hung in streets and fields where they'd been gunned down or executed, sometimes years earlier. Now the Russians were out to repay the debt as they surged into East Prussia. Despite the Soviet commanders' best efforts to control their men, rape, murder, and pillage were leveled against any German who was unlucky enough to be trapped in the line of advance. Horrified civilians fled in blind panic, desperate to reach the hoped-for safety of central Germany, or, if luck was with them, all the way to the Western Front, where they could surrender safely to the Americans or British. In sub-zero temperatures, pursued by the enraged Russians, tens of thousands froze, starved, or were gunned down. Faced with this unprecedented disaster, rather than concentrate his few remaining forces on protecting his collapsing defensive positions, Adolf Hitler decided on a diversionary maneuver in Hungary in the hope that the Russians would halt their advance to shore up their rear. It was a foolish ploy, and Marshal Zhukov was not taken in. The Germans were quickly driven out of Hungary, just as they were being driven out of East Prussia. By mid-February, things on Germany's Western Front fared no better than in the East. In mid-December 1944, the Germans had launched their last major push, known as the Battle of the Bulge, in a drastic attempt to drive the Western Allies from the continent. Since then, the undersupplied Germans had been steadily forced out of Belgium toward the border of their own country. Although Hitler's bulge strategy failed, the British and Americans had to fight long and hard to push back the Germans, and there was still a long way to go before they'd reach Berlin. Considering the tenacity of the Germans and how far German manpower and supplies were stretched, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower knew that the most effective way to deal with the situation was by mounting a two-pronged attack on the enemy line, thus dividing their already overextended forces. While British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery dealt with the northern end of the German line, US General Omar Bradley whittled away at them from the south. Still, from the Bulge's initial collapse on January the 28th, it took until the 7th of March to push the Axis forces back to the Rhine River inside the German border. 5 weeks to move the Allied front line 60 miles forward, and every mile had been bitterly contested by an army who were now protecting their homeland rather than occupied territory. Now the battle would focus on controlling the Rhine itself. As one of the last remaining routes by which the Germans could move equipment and supplies up and down the Western Front, Hitler ordered it to be defended to the last man. Frantic to keep the Americans from crossing the river as the enemy approached, German engineers opened the floodgates in several major dams along the river. Tens of millions of gallons of water flooded valleys, roads, and towns, impeding the Allied crossing. It did slow down the advance, but only for a few days. Scrambling to keep his armies functional while holding back the Allies for as long as possible, Hitler ordered that all bridges over all major waterways were to be blown up when the enemy came within 12 miles of a bridgehead. Once the bridges were destroyed, German troops were to pull back to the next defensible position. Again, this only served as a delaying action. Where bridges were destroyed, American engineers erected temporary pontoon bridges, and men and equipment soon rolled forward. With the way through Germany now open, General Eisenhower was faced with a major decision. Should American, British, and Canadian forces make a concerted push on Berlin, which was now only 300 miles to the east, or allow the Red Army the honor of taking the Reich's capital? The decision was as much a political one as it was tactical. The alliance between the Western powers and Soviet Russia was fragile at the best of times. And with German territory about to be carved up among the victors, the last thing Ike Eisenhower wanted to do was lose American and British lives, taking territory that would ultimately be handed to Russia. On the other hand, he could not afford to do anything that might upset the notoriously volatile Joseph Stalin. There was little doubt that the Americans could have reached Berlin in about the same length of time as the Russians, but if both armies converged on the city at the same time, the fight between German defenders and US and Soviet advanced forces could become impossibly confused. Even an inadvertent clash between American and Russian forces could have led to an entirely new war, and that was a situation Eisenhower could not afford at any cost. Consequently, against the advice of Field Marshal Montgomery and plainly stated demands of Winston Churchill, Ike decided the wisest thing was to make plans to cut Germany in half by linking up with the Russians south of the capital, but leave Berlin itself to Stalin's men. With enemy armies closing in from all sides, by March 1945, Hitler began to realize that his great plan had failed. In his mind, however, the fault lay not only with his enemies, but also with the German people themselves. In a conversation with Armaments Minister Albert Speer, Hitler said, "If the war is lost, there is no need to take into consideration the basic requirements of the people. Those who remain after the battle are those who are inferior, for the good will have fallen." With this grim thought in mind, and despite Speer's protests, on March the 19th, Hitler ordered area commanders and local governors, known as Gauleiters, to see to the destruction of all industrial facilities, energy sources, railway locomotives, carriages, and railway lines. Even food supplies in warehouses were to be destroyed. 4 days later, on the 23rd, an even more horrific command was put out. All prisoners, those in forced labor camps, regular prisons, and prisoners of war, were to be moved from outlying areas of the country to be used to form a human shield against the advancing Russian army. Fortunately, Speer, in cooperation with Field Marshal Walter Model, saw to it that this nightmarish command was never carried out. As Stalin's armies moved relentlessly towards Berlin, Hitler tried everything he could to encourage his exhausted troops to ever more impossible efforts. On April the 14th, 1945, he sent a directive to the men on the Eastern Front, which said in part, "The enemy is trying to reduce Germany to rubble and exterminate our people. While men, children, and old people will be murdered, women and girls will be reduced to barrack room whores." There may have been a certain truth in portraying the Russians as merciless, but in view of Hitler's own recent orders and Germany's record of abuses in the countries they'd overrun, it was hypocrisy at its most outrageous. If Hitler was determined to make his armies fight to the last man, most of his soldiers would have been only too happy to surrender, at least those who were facing US, UK, or Canadian forces. There were, however, millions of fanatically dedicated men in the Waffen-SS, and millions more trapped on the Russian front, who realized that surrender would be nearly indistinguishable from suicide. Many of those trapped on the Eastern Front, particularly the officers, fought not only to save their own lives, but to buy time for civilians to be evacuated as far as possible from the enemy. Bolstering every soldier's fighting spirit was the very real fear of being summarily tried and executed by the SS or Gestapo if they were suspected of cowardice. By the beginning of 1945, even the slightest mention of withdrawal or surrender was a treasonable offense in Nazi Germany. For the millions of dazed and terrified civilians trapped in the three-way struggle between two invading armies and a government clearly gone mad, the only possible choice was to try to survive long enough to surrender to the Western Allies. But for those still trapped in the eastern portions of Germany, that hope was dwindling rapidly. By April the 16th, the Russians had crossed the Oder River and were well on their way to Berlin itself. For months, Hitler and the few generals he still trusted had been trying to devise ways to fend off the inevitable enemy attack on Berlin. As early as August 1944, desperate to fill the ranks of an ever-dwindling labor force, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, had ordered total mobilization. The work week was increased to 60 hours, and all public entertainment, including cinemas, theaters and restaurants, were closed. There'd been no more fun in the Third Reich. In a last-ditch attempt to bolster the strength of his collapsing armies, in October 1944, Hitler had demanded compulsory conscription of all able-bodied males between the ages of 16 and 60. When even these numbers proved inadequate to the need, thousands beyond the age of retirement and thousands more who'd hardly reached puberty were called into service. Most of the youth forces were drawn from the ranks of the Hitler Youth, boys who'd spent their entire lives being taught that their Führer was little less than a god.
Adolf Hitler ist unser Retter, unser Held, der edelste Führer auf der ganzen Welt. Für Hitler leben wir und wir sterben gerne wir. Für den Führer bis zum Tod, denn er ist unser Gott.
Because their short lives had been filled with continuous indoctrination, many of these boys fought as fanatically as the most hardened SS units. US and British soldiers who found themselves facing these child warriors were faced with an awful moral quandary. Even in a war, killing children was inconceivable. But these children had sworn to defend their Führer to the death and were not to be underestimated nor trifled with.
Ich schwöre bei Gott diesen heiligen Eid, dass ich dem Führer des Großdeutschen Reiches und Volkes, Adolf Hitler, den obersten Befehlshaber der Wehrmacht, unbedingten Gehorsam leisten und als tapferer Soldat bereit sein will, jederzeit für diesen Eid mein Leben einzusetzen.
Most of the new German recruits, young and old alike, were mustered into Home Guard or Volkssturm units. Weapons in critically short supply, those with real rifles, machine guns or grenade launchers could consider themselves lucky. Many were armed with no more than crude homemade rifles, from which reused shell cartridges were fitted with sharpened wooden slugs that could inflict horrible wounds at short range. With the help of this ad hoc army, 3 massive lines of defense stretching nearly 200 miles were built around the eastern perimeter of Berlin. There were tank traps, machine gun and artillery emplacements, and ditches to be filled with gasoline and oil and set afire when the time came. Defending the city itself were the 3rd Panzer Army and the 9th Regular Army. The 9th Army was charged with guarding the perimeter of the city, while the Panzers were stationed further afield. To the south was 4th Panzer Army and the remains of Army Group Center, which, 3.5 years earlier, had led the attack into Russia. In reserve were the 56th Panzer Corps and the 12th Army. But all the armies were greatly reduced from their official strength and largely made up of raw recruits, old men and boys. Inside the city limits of Berlin, there were also roughly 100 Home Guard battalions, augmented by local SS police units. The total number of Germans rounded up, cobbled together and recruited for the final battle against the vast forces of the Soviet Union totaled around 1 million men. By contrast, the combined Russian forces facing them included more than 3.25 million battle-hardened troops, backed by an array of tanks, planes and artillery, all far superior to anything remaining to the Germans. Russian armaments specifically reserved for the final push into the heart of Berlin included more than 4,000 tanks. Isolated in the underground Führer bunker, a completely out-of-touch Hitler still believed that his shattered military could stem the tide of battle if they really wanted to. On April the 15th, he told his troops, "The Bolshevists must and shall fall before the capital city of the Reich." It was the ultimate delusion. 2 weeks earlier, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin had given his generals their final orders for the capture of Berlin. The day after Hitler's overconfident speech, April the 16th, Russian artillery opened a massive barrage designed to soften up the first of Berlin's 3 rings of defense. With an average of 1 artillery piece for every 13 feet of a line 55 miles long, a total of more than 22,300 guns, the noise and destruction was beyond imagination. That evening, Russian soldiers could see Berlin burning in the distance. 48 hours later, the city's outer ring of defenses cracked. By April the 19th, 3 days into the battle, Soviet forces had ploughed through all 3 lines of defense and were heading into the northern outskirts of the city itself. In their dramatic advance, the Russians had trapped the 9th Army, the 3rd Panzer Army, and much of the 4th Panzer Army in isolated pockets southeast of the capital, thus making them useless in the defense of the city. Hitler had not been out of Berlin since the beginning of the year. Initially, he'd stayed on to direct the failing defense of the country, and then, as the enemy closed in, to organize the defense of the city. By April the 20th, the Führer's 56th birthday, there were few escape routes left to Hitler, or any Berliner. His birthday celebrations, which marked the last gathering of his inner circle, including propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, SS chief Heinrich Himmler, party secretary Martin Bormann, and Air Marshal Hermann Goering, was a grim affair. The engineers of Nazi tyranny took turns offering their congratulations to a leader who was hardly capable of understanding what was going on outside the confines of his bunker. Outside, in the real world, Berlin lay in flaming ruins. Virtually all services had been destroyed, and the city center was little more than a bombed-out shell. As if to mark the Führer's birthday, the Western Allies were carrying out their last major bombing run on the capital. In the bunker, many of the guests urged Hitler to escape with them to Bavaria, where they were planning to mount a last-ditch defense. Hitler adamantly refused, believing that if he stayed behind, he could hold back the tide of history, insisting the Russians could still be driven out. He was encouraged in his delusion by reports from fanatical SS commanders who claimed they were about to mount a counterattack on both Russian and American positions. Late in the afternoon, everyone but Martin Bormann, Goebbels and his family, and a few guards and aides fled the bunker and the destruction of their empire. In the streets of Berlin, things were collapsing faster than even the most realistic of Hitler's compatriots could have imagined a few short weeks earlier. The day after Hitler's birthday, April the 21st, Russian advance units crossed the Autobahn Ring Road north of town. From the south, more Soviet troops moved in through the suburbs. By April the 22nd, even Hitler realized that if something drastic didn't happen, the Russians would overrun the city in a matter of days. Frantically, he ordered all units currently fighting in the west to abandon their positions and help fend off the Russians. As had so often happened in recent months, by the time Adolf Hitler understood what was happening, it was too late to do anything about it. The next day, knowing that Hitler was hopelessly trapped in Berlin, Air Marshal Goering, safe for the moment in Bavaria, sent a telegram to the Führer bunker. In it, he offered to take over leadership of the Reich. If he received no reply by 10 p.m., Goering said, "I shall take it for granted that you have lost your freedom of action and shall act for the best interests of our people." Hitler was beside himself with fury. He called Goering a traitor and screamed that he would not be given ultimatums. Believing that even his closest friends were now betraying him, Hitler ordered the arrest of Goering, but there was no one left to carry out the order. On April the 24th, the two Russian armies, Zhukov's advancing down from the north and Konyev's coming up from the south, met in the southwest corner of Berlin. The following day, US and Soviet troops met at the village of Torgau on the banks of the Elbe River, cutting Germany neatly in half, exactly as Eisenhower had planned a month earlier. The same day the Western and Eastern Allies met, Russia began taking their final revenge for the 20 million deaths Nazi Germany had inflicted on their nation. The opening maneuver was a massive air assault designed to kill off as many of Berlin's defenders as possible before the army moved in on them. Most of the regular army and Home Guard units still defending Berlin would probably have broken and run had it not been for the presence of the SS, who took almost as much delight in killing suspected deserters as in shooting Russians. But also trapped in the inferno were hundreds of thousands of civilians. Those who had not already been killed by the bombs, drafted into the Home Guard, or fled long ago, huddled in the basements of their homes, awaiting their murder or deportation to Siberia. Terrified of what would happen to them if they were captured by the dreaded Red Army, hundreds, possibly thousands of women killed their daughters and then committed suicide. By the evening of the 27th, the remaining Berlin garrison was trapped in a narrow corridor ranging between 1 and 3 miles wide and no more than 10 miles long. The 9th German Army, which Hitler continued to believe would come to Berlin's aid, was still fighting for their lives several miles south of the city center. The following day, Hitler learned that even SS Chief Heinrich Himmler had been trying to negotiate an armistice with the Western Allies through a Swedish intermediary, but that the offer had been rejected out of hand. If there were any way to make Hitler's position worse, that same day, the commandant of the battered Berlin garrison reported that there was only enough ammunition left to continue fighting for 2 days, and the city was virtually without food. When he reported back the next day, he explained that due to the ferocity of the Russian attack, nearly all of the ammunition had been expended. Now, even Hitler knew there was no hope left. That day, the advancing Russians had broken through the last line of defenses at 2 points, encircling and trapping the defenders in 3 small pockets. The following day, deep in the Führer bunker, Hitler spent his time drafting his will, lashing out at everyone who'd betrayed him. He stripped both Goering and Himmler of their offices, blamed the Jews for all the misfortunes that had befallen Germany, and told those who still believed in him to, in his words, set a shining example of devotion to duty unto death. Lastly, he nominated Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. A man who had never taken part in the plotting and planning of the war was now left with the unenviable job of overseeing the final collapse of the Reich. Later that evening, in a ceremony even more morose than his birthday party, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun. By the time of the usual midday briefing on April the 30th, the Russians were surging through the city center, had already overrun Gestapo headquarters, were closing in on the Reichstag building, which had housed Germany's parliament, and the nearby chancellery, beneath which lay the Führer bunker. The massive dome of the Reichstag, which had long dominated the Berlin skyline, had been reduced to a skeleton by months of shelling and aerial bombing, and much of the interior was a burned-out ruin. Now the Russians moved in with rockets and artillery fire, determined to ferret out the remaining defenders who'd taken the massive ruins as a last redoubt. The barrage continued from dawn till after 1:30, and only then did Zhukov think it safe to launch a direct assault on the building. Although the heavy artillery and anti-aircraft guns mounted in the Reichstag's forecourt had been abandoned, a massive anti-tank ditch ripped through the paving stones surrounding the building, making it impossible for the Russians to move their tanks to the entrance. Infantrymen from 3 separate regiments repeatedly stormed the building, but more than 5,000 SS Regular Army and Home Guard troops who were holed up inside were not to be winkled out easily. The windows of the Reichstag's 2 lower stories had been bricked up, transforming it into a massive bunker. There was no way for the attackers to fire into the interior to pick off the defenders as they scurried around, regrouping against the final assault. From bombs shattered upper stories, hand grenades and machine gun fire rained down on the advancing Soviet soldiers. The first attack on the Reichstag was successfully repulsed. But a second one, launched around 6 p.m., fared better. As the first troops surged through the massive doorway, driving the defenders before them, a small party ignored the constant fire and clambered up the scarred face of the building to raise the red flag on the roof beneath the shattered dome. By the time the conqueror's banner proclaimed their victory over Nazi Germany, it was nearly 11 p.m. Inside the Reichstag, events may have been less heroic, but they were every bit as dangerous. Room by room, corridor by smoke-filled corridor, the bloody battle ebbed and flowed for hours on end, all through the night and the next day. It would take more than 2 days for the last defenders of the Reichstag to be cleared out, nearly half of them dying where they stood rather than be taken prisoner. While the battle for the Reichstag raged, 200 yards away, things in the Führer bunker had deteriorated as far as they possibly could. Shortly after midday, Hitler ordered his chauffeur to go out and find as many cans of petrol as possible. He then called the few who'd remained with him, including Joseph and Magda Goebbels, their children, and Martin Bormann, and his aides and servants, shook them all by the hand, thanked them for their loyalty, and wished them well. That done, he and Eva excused themselves and went to their private quarters. A few minutes later, shortly after 3:30 p.m., a single shot rang through the corridors of the bunker. When aides ran to Hitler's sitting room, they found the bodies of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun lying where they had fallen. She had taken cyanide. He had shot himself through the head. Their bodies were taken out to what remained of the Chancellery garden and placed in an empty decorative pond. The gasoline, scavenged by his chauffeur, was poured over them and set alight. There would be no remains for the Russians to cart back to Moscow as trophies. The next morning, May the 1st, Martin Bormann ordered General Hans Krebs to approach the Russians, tell them Hitler was dead, and try to negotiate a ceasefire. The Russians' reply was simple. There would be no ceasefire. Nothing less than unconditional surrender was acceptable. Goebbels, Bormann, and Krebs mulled over the demand for hours before finally rejecting it. Sometime around 7 o'clock that evening, as Bormann made a mad dash for freedom through the bullet-ridden streets of the city, Magda Goebbels dressed her children in their finest party clothes, combed their hair, and fed them cyanide-laced cakes. Her husband then gave her a cyanide capsule, shot her through the neck, and then shot himself. Their bodies were taken to the garden, doused with the remaining petrol, and set alight. 3 others, including General Krebs, Hitler's adjutant, General Bergdorf, and SS Captain Franz Schelde, also killed themselves rather than be taken by the enemies of the Reich. The following morning, May the 2nd, Berlin's garrison commander, General Wilding, informed the Russians by radio that he was willing to surrender the city. At 2:15 p.m., the 56th Panzer Corps, the last armored unit in Berlin, surrendered to the Russians. Minutes later, the city's remaining defenders followed suit. The surviving inhabitants were left with a bewildering concoction of defeat, loss, fear, and desperation. The Führer's promises of national greatness now no more than a distant echo. Although there are no accurate figures for casualties during the Battle for Berlin, the best estimates are that 100,000 German troops, an equal number of civilians, and approximately the same number of Russian soldiers were killed. A total of 300,000 men, women, and children had died among the smouldering ruins that had once been the heart of the Nazis' twisted dream of world conquest.